how many of these forgotten bands from the 1970s do you actually remember? Behind the faded album covers and the songs that never got their due airplay, there are stories of betrayal, heartbreak, and loss that most casual fans never hear about. Electrocutions, stolen fortunes, demons that came with fame too fast and money too tight. So sit back, because today we're counting down 6 most tragic stories of 1970s forgotten bands. Number 6, Badfinger. If you were listening to the radio in the early 1970s, there's a good chance you heard Badfinger without necessarily knowing who they were. Signed to Apple Records, the label founded by the Beatles themselves, this Welsh and English quartet seemed destined for greatness. Paul McCartney wrote them a hit. George Harrison invited them to perform at the concert for Bangladesh. Their song, Without You, co-written by band members Pete Ham and Tom Evans, would go on to become one of the most covered songs in pop music history. For a brief moment, Badfinger looked like the next great British rock export. But behind the scenes, the band had placed its trust in a manager named Stan Polly, a man who controlled nearly every financial aspect of their career. Polly set up an elaborate web of corporations and escrow accounts, and the members of Badfinger had little insight into where their money was actually going. As the band's albums continued to sell and their songs continued to be recorded by other artists, the members themselves saw almost none of the profits. Salaries stopped arriving. Legal disputes piled up. The band that had once played alongside some of the biggest names in music now found itself unable to pay for basic living expenses. The pressure became unbearable for Pete Ham. In April of 1975, after learning that money he believed was set aside for the band had disappeared, Ham took his own life at his home in Surrey, England. He left behind a note that named his manager directly, blaming him for the financial ruin that had consumed his final months. He was 27 years old and his daughter was born just weeks after his death. Before all of this, Badfinger had genuinely been on top of the world. They started out as a group called the Ivies before being signed to Apple Records in 1968, becoming one of the very first acts the Beatles label put its weight behind. Paul McCartney personally wrote and produced their breakthrough single, Come and Get It, and the band's members went on to play behind George Harrison on his album All Things Must Pass, and behind John Lennon on Imagine. For a group of young musicians from Wales and England, sharing studio space with their own musical heroes must have felt like validation beyond anything they could have imagined a few years earlier. Their own albums, Straight Up and No Dice, produced a string of hits, and it seemed only a matter of time before Badfinger stepped fully out of the Beatles' shadow and became stars in their own right. That is precisely what makes what happened next so difficult to comprehend. When the band hired Stan Polly as their manager in 1970, they believed they were finally putting their business affairs into capable professional hands. Instead, Polly funneled money through a maze of accounts that left even accountants confused, and while the band toured and recorded, Polly reportedly lived comfortably off earnings that should have gone to the musicians themselves. By 1974, the group could no longer make payroll. Session players and studio time went unpaid. The band that had once backed up the biggest names in music now found itself begging its own label just to stay afloat. The tragedy did not end there. Tom Evans, Ham's closest friend and songwriting partner, never fully recovered from the loss. He continued performing under the Badfinger name through the years that followed, reuniting at different points with fellow original member Joey Molland, but the legal battles over royalties, including disputes tied to their most famous song, Without You, wore him down further. Friends who knew him in his final years described a man who had grown withdrawn, exhausted by years of litigation and grief that never seemed to end. In November of 1983, 8 years after Ham's death, Tom Evans also took his own life. Two members of the same band, driven to the same devastating end, both connected to the same unresolved betrayal by a manager who was not held legally accountable until 1991, and even then faced no prison time at all. Badfinger's music continued to live on through other artists' recordings, but the band itself became a cautionary tale whispered about in the music industry for decades afterward, often cited as the reason so many later acts began hiring independent lawyers and accountants of their own before signing anything. Number 5. Crazy Horse. Before Crazy Horse became known primarily as Neil Young's longtime backing band, they were their own group, built around the raw, emotional guitar playing and songwriting of Danny Whitten. Whitten had co-founded the group in the late 1960s, and his voice and guitar work became central to some of Young's most celebrated early recordings, including songs on Everybody Knows This Is Nowhere and After the Gold Rush. Those close to the band described Whitten as a deeply talented and generous musician, someone capable of pulling entire songs together with just a few chord changes. Crazy Horse itself began as a doo-wop vocal group called Danny and the Memories, before evolving into a full rock band alongside bassist Billy Talbot and drummer Ralph Molina, the two members who would go on to anchor the group for decades to come. Neil Young discovered them playing at the Whiskey A Go-Go in Los Angeles and was immediately drawn to their raw, unpolished energy, eventually bringing Whitten, Talbot, and Molina in to back him on his early solo records. By the early 1970s, however, Whitten's struggle with drug addiction had become impossible to ignore. His playing grew unreliable, and members of the band, along with Young himself, made the painful decision that he could no longer continue touring with them. Neil Young later wrote about Whitten's decline in one of his most personal songs of the era, reflecting on how addiction can quietly dismantle even the most gifted people. Even after being let go, Young tried to help, and at one point invited Whitten back to rehearse for an upcoming tour, hoping he might have gotten well enough to return. In November of 1972, that hope did not hold. After it became clear during rehearsals that Whitten still was not ready, Young made the difficult decision to send him home, giving him $50 and a plane ticket. That same night, Whitten was found dead, the result of a combination of alcohol and prescription medication after years of struggling with substance abuse. He was 29 years old. His death devastated the surviving members of Crazy Horse and Neil Young alike, particularly since a roadie close to the band named Bruce Berry would die from similar causes not long afterward. Together, their deaths directly inspired one of the darkest and most emotionally raw albums of Young's career, a record built almost entirely around grief and loss, and recorded with the surviving members of Crazy Horse still reeling from what had happened. Crazy Horse would eventually reform and continue on for decades as Young's most enduring musical partnership, but the band's founding voice never got to see any of it. Danny Whitten remains one of the most talented and least remembered architects of the sound that would later influence entire generations of rock musicians. Number 4. Big Star. Formed in Memphis, Tennessee in 1971, Big Star brought together the songwriting talents of Alex Chilton, who had already tasted success as a teenage vocalist with the Box Tops, and Chris Bell, a gifted guitarist and singer with a quieter, more introspective presence. The two of them modeled their partnership loosely on Lennon and McCartney, trading off lead vocals and songwriting credits, with drummer Jody Stevens and bassist Andy Hummel rounding out a lineup that, on paper, had every ingredient needed for stardom. Together, they wrote and recorded an album called Number 1 Record, released in 1972, that critics at the time called nearly flawless. Rolling Stone and Billboard both praised it, with one review suggesting nearly every song could stand as its own single. It should have been the launching point for a major career. Instead, the record's label was unable to properly distribute or promote the album, and despite the glowing reviews, it barely sold. For Chris Bell, who had poured himself into the songwriting and studio work far more intensely than his bandmates realized, the commercial failure was devastating. He grew increasingly frustrated as much of the critical attention gravitated toward Chilton, and by the end of the 1972, Bell had left the band he helped create. Meanwhile, the band itself limped forward without him. Alex Chilton, along with drummer Jody Stevens and bassist Andy Hummel, recorded a second album, Radio City, in 1974, again to strong reviews and again to almost no commercial success. A planned third record turned into a dark, fragmented project later released as Third, or sometimes Sister Lovers, an album that many now consider one of the most emotionally raw recordings of the decade, though almost nobody heard it at the time it was made. Bell, meanwhile, spent the years after leaving the band trying to build a solo career, working at his father's restaurant to support himself, while continuing to record demos with old friends in Memphis, including occasional sessions with Chilton himself. He struggled privately with depression during this period, and only one single from his solo material, a song called I Am the Cosmos, was released while he was alive. In the final weeks of 1978, there were small signs that things might be turning around. A tiny label run by a fellow musician had pressed that single, and a reissue of the first two Big Star albums was gaining some renewed international attention overseas. Bell had even begun discussing the possibility of a Big Star reunion, and by all accounts felt more hopeful about his music than he had in years. On the night of December 26, 1978, Bell attended a rehearsal and jam session with friends that stretched late into the night. In the early hours of December 27th, he got into his small Triumph sports car to drive home from the studio. He lost control of the vehicle and struck a wooden light pole, dying instantly at the age of 27. His funeral was held the very next day, which happened to be Alex Chilton's birthday. Big Star's music, largely ignored during its own era, would go on to influence entire generations of musicians in the decades that followed, with bands like R.E.M. and The Replacements publicly crediting the group as a major inspiration, and a documentary decades later finally telling the full story of what the band had accomplished. Chris Bell never got to witness any of that influence take hold, and Alex Chilton himself passed away years later in 2010, having spent much of his life aware that the record he and Bell made together was slowly becoming recognized as one of the great lost albums of American rock. Number 3. Stone the Crows. Formed in Glasgow, Scotland in late 1969, Stone the Crows built a devoted following around the powerful voice of singer Maggie Bell and the tasteful, understated guitar work of Les Harvey. The two had actually first played together as teenagers, long before the band took shape, and their earlier group evolved into Stone the Crows once Led Zeppelin's manager, Peter Grant, took notice and helped christen the new lineup. By the early 1970s, they had released 3 well-received albums and were widely seen as one of the most promising acts to emerge from the British blues rock scene. Harvey himself came from a musical family. His older brother, Alex Harvey, would go on to lead his own well-known group, the sensational Alex Harvey Band. And it was Alex who first introduced his younger brother to Maggie Bell years earlier, setting the whole chain of events that formed Stone the Crows into motion. By 1972, the band had released 3 albums: Stone the Crows, Ode to John Law, and Teenage Licks, each one showing steady growth in songwriting and musicianship, and industry insiders increasingly spoke of them as a band on the verge of a real commercial breakthrough. On May 3, 1972, the band arrived at the Top Rank Ballroom in Swansea, Wales, to perform for a university event. Earlier that evening, members of the crowd had reportedly damaged some of the band's wiring, and while road crew members made repairs before the show, one loose ground wire went unnoticed. During the soundcheck, before the show had even officially begun, Harvey stepped up to announce a technical issue with the equipment to the crowd. As he reached for the microphone while still holding his guitar, the ungrounded wire sent a fatal electrical current through his body. Witnesses described a strange humming sound just before it happened. Bandmates who rushed to help him were shocked themselves as they tried to pull him away from the equipment, and it was only when the drummer managed to kick the guitar loose from Harvey's hand that anyone could safely reach him. Harvey was rushed to a nearby hospital where he was pronounced dead. He was 27 years old. Maggie Bell, who had been his longtime partner as well as his bandmate, collapsed and was hospitalized in the aftermath. The band attempted to continue, bringing in a 19-year-old guitarist named Jimmy McCulloch to fill the void Harvey left behind, and they released one more album together later that year. But the loss proved impossible to overcome, and Stone the Crows broke up entirely by 1973. Maggie Bell went on to build a respected solo career, recording albums with the same producer who worked with Aretha Franklin and Ray Charles, while McCulloch himself later joined Paul McCartney's band Wings before his own life was cut short by drug-related causes in 1979. The band that had once seemed destined for major stardom became, in the years that followed, largely a footnote remembered mostly for the freak accident that ended it. For those who were there, though, Stone the Crows represented one of the great lost promises of early 1970s British rock, cut short in the most sudden and senseless way imaginable, in front of an audience that had come simply to hear them play. Number 2. Death. In Detroit in the early 1970s, three brothers named David, Bobby, and Dennis Hackney were making music that nobody around them quite understood yet. They started out playing funk, inspired by the Motown sound all around them, but after watching The Who and Alice Cooper perform live, something shifted. The brothers began writing fast, aggressive, guitar-driven rock songs years before anyone was using the word punk to describe that kind of sound. David, the oldest and the band's guitarist and visionary, insisted on naming the group Death, a decision he made after their father passed away in an accident. For David, the name wasn't meant to be morbid. He wanted to reclaim the word, to turn something feared into something powerful. Before they were Death, the brothers played together under the name Rockfire Funk Express, working through a Motown-influenced sound that reflected the city around them. It was only after seeing rock acts perform live that they decided to change direction entirely, trading horn sections and dance grooves for distorted guitars and pounding drums. In doing so, they became something almost nobody in Detroit's music scene had seen before. An all-black band playing a style of music that record executives at the time associated almost exclusively with white performers. That alone made industry doors harder to open, long before the band's chosen name became an additional obstacle. That name, however, closed almost every remaining door in the music industry. On February 18, 1975, the band recorded 7 songs at Detroit's United Sound Systems, catching the attention of a well-known local producer and eventually drawing interest from Columbia Records. For a moment, it looked like their break had finally arrived, but Columbia's own president personally asked the brothers to change the band's name before he would move forward with a deal. David refused, standing firm on the meaning he had built around the word. His brothers respected his conviction, even though it meant walking away from what may have been their only shot at wide recognition. Without a label willing to work with them, the band eventually dissolved in 1977, and the brothers relocated from Detroit to Burlington, Vermont, where they shifted into gospel and later reggae music under different band names entirely, quietly leaving their proto-punk recordings behind them. For over 3 decades, the recordings Death made in that small Detroit studio sat largely forgotten, known only to the brothers themselves and a small handful of collectors who occasionally passed around bootleg copies of the 7-inch single they pressed independently. David Hackney, who had returned to Detroit in the 1980s, still hoping to find an audience for the sound he had pioneered, passed away in 2000 after a battle with lung cancer. He never lived to see what would happen next. In the years following his death, collectors and music historians began to recognize just how far ahead of its time that 1975 session truly was, with some going so far as to argue Death had been playing a form of punk rock years before bands in New York and London were credited with inventing it. Death's surviving brothers, Bobby and Dennis, were eventually able to see their music reach the audience it had always deserved, releasing archival collections and even performing again decades later, at times alongside a new generation of the family, including Bobby's own sons, who had formed their own band without initially knowing their father and uncle had once done the very same thing. David himself, the man who insisted on keeping the name that cost them everything, was gone before any of it happened. It remains one of the most quietly heartbreaking stories in American rock history, a band that helped shape a genre without ever getting to witness the impact of what they built. Number 1. The Flying Burrito Brothers. Formed in 1969 by Graham Parsons and Chris Hillman, both formerly of the Byrds, the Flying Burrito Brothers helped pioneer a fusion of country twang and rock instrumentation that would later be credited as one of the founding blueprints of an entire genre. The band's debut lineup also included steel guitarist Sneaky Pete Kleinow, whose weeping, unconventional playing style became one of the group's most distinctive sonic signatures. Their debut album, The Gilded Palace of Sin, was a commercial disappointment at the time of its release, but its influence would eventually reach far beyond what anyone in the band could have predicted, shaping the sound of acts that came along years later. Before forming the Flying Burrito Brothers, Parsons had already made his mark on the Byrds, steering that band's landmark album, Sweetheart of the Rodeo, toward the country influences he had grown up loving in the American South. When he and Hillman left the Byrds to start their own group, they carried that same vision forward, blending twangy pedal steel guitar with rock and soul instrumentation at a time when almost nobody in either the country world or the rock world thought the two belonged together. But I don't want no one but you. Graham Parsons, the band's most visible member, struggled with addiction throughout his time with the group, and he was ultimately let go before their second album, Burrito Deluxe, was even released. He continued on as a solo artist through the early 1970s, working closely with a then largely unknown singer named Emmylou Harris and recording 2 albums, GP and Grievous Angel, that music historians would later regard as some of the finest country rock records ever made. Success, however, remained just out of reach during his lifetime, and by the time his second solo album was released, he was no longer alive to see it reach listeners. In September of 1973, while staying at a small inn near Joshua Tree National Park in California, a place he had visited many times before to unwind and watch the night sky, Parsons died from an overdose of alcohol and drugs at the age of 26. What followed became one of the strangest chapters in rock history. Parsons had once made an informal pact with his road manager, Phil Kaufman, at another musician's funeral, agreeing that whichever of them died first, the other would ensure the body was cremated out in the desert near Joshua Tree, rather than given a conventional burial. When Parsons' stepfather arranged to fly his body back to Louisiana instead, without inviting any of Parsons' friends from the music industry to the service, Kaufman took matters into his own hands. He and a friend borrowed an old hearse, talked their way past airport staff by claiming the funeral arrangements had changed, and intercepted the coffin before it could be loaded onto a commercial flight. They drove it out into the park and set it ablaze near a rock formation the 2 men had visited together many times before. Campers in the area reported the fire, and authorities eventually caught up with the 2 men, fining them for the theft of the coffin, though no serious charges were ever filed, since at the time there was no specific law against stealing a body. Parsons' remains were later properly buried in Louisiana, and the legal matter was fully settled that November. His music, largely overlooked while he was alive, would go on to influence country rock for decades to come. But Graham Parsons himself never lived to see any part of that legacy take shape.
I'm your toy, I'm your old.
6 bands, 6 stories that never quite got the recognition they deserved, and 6 reminders that behind every song still spinning on classic rock radio, there's a very human story that often ended far too soon. Some of these musicians were betrayed by the very people they trusted to protect them. Some were taken by accidents no one could have prevented. Some simply couldn't hold on long enough to see the world finally catch up to what they had already created. And yet, decades later, their music has found its way back into the hands of new listeners, proof that even the most overlooked recordings can eventually find the audience they were always meant to reach. If you found yourself remembering any of these bands or discovering them for the first time today, let us know in the comments which of these stories moved you the most. And if you enjoyed this look back at the forgotten corners of 1970s music, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more stories about the artist history nearly left behind.